Chapter 1. The Quiet Life of Greg Benson. Greg Benson had never been the kind of man to chase after big dreams. Not because he didn't have any, he had plenty, but because somewhere along the way, life taught him that dreams were expensive and he wasn't in the business of spending. At 31, Greg lived in the same town he'd been born in, Westfield, population just under 4,000. A place where everyone knew everyone, and if they didn't, they knew someone who did. Gossip traveled faster than the wind here, and secrets were rarer than gold. Which was ironic, considering Greg had a basement full of it. On a crisp January morning, Greg stood in his driveway, breath puffing out in little clouds as he loaded a rusted washing machine into the bed of his old F-100 pickup. The truck groaned under the weight, its faded teal paint chipped and scarred from decades of use. His grandfather had left it to him, and Greg treated it like a family heirloom, because in Westfield, a truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a statement. He said, "I'm practical, I'm reliable, and I don't care what you think." "Come on, old girl," Greg muttered, giving the tailgate a firm slap. "One more trip." The washing machine clanked against the side of the bed, settling in with a metallic sigh. Greg wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced toward the tree line. Beyond that stretch of forest was his house, a modest two-story tucked so far back that most folks didn't even know it existed, which was exactly how Greg liked it. Privacy wasn't just a preference. It was a necessity when your basement looked like Fort Knox. He climbed into the truck, the seat springs protesting under his weight, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before rumbling to life. As he pulled onto the narrow road leading into town, Greg's mind wandered to the growing problem he'd been ignoring for months: space. Or rather, the lack of it. His basement was packed wall to wall with neatly stacked ingots: copper, aluminum, zinc, silver, and gold. All melted down from the junk he hauled. All worth more than he'd ever need. And all completely useless to him because he had no idea how to sell it without turning his life upside down. Money changes people, his grandfather used to say. And people change you. Greg believed that. He'd seen it happen. So he kept his secret locked away, even as the stacks grew higher and the floor space shrank smaller. The truck rattled down Main Street, past the familiar landmarks of Westfield. The 1950s-style diner with its neon sign flickering like a tired firefly, the single-screen movie theater that played 2 films a month, and the hardware store where Greg bought most of his supplies. A few folks waved as he drove by: Mrs. Callahan from the bakery, old Mr. Turner sweeping his porch. Greg lifted a hand in return, offering the kind of smile that said, "I'm fine, thanks for asking," even though nobody really asked. He parked behind the diner, where the owner, Pete, was waiting with a busted freezer door. "Morning, Greg," Pete called, his breath fogging in the cold. "You're a lifesaver." Greg hopped out of the truck. "Depends on the day," he said, grabbing his toolbox from the cab. "What's the trouble?" Pete led him inside, where the smell of bacon and coffee wrapped around Greg like a warm blanket. The diner was half full, farmers nursing mugs of black coffee, teenagers sharing milkshakes, and a couple of retirees arguing about last night's bingo game. Greg nodded to a few familiar faces, then crouched in front of the freezer. "Door won't close," Pete explained. "Keeps popping open like it's got a mind of its own." Greg inspected the hinge, running his fingers along the metal. "Looks like the pin's bent," he said. "Probably from someone leaning on it." Pete groaned. "Kids these days." Greg chuckled. "Give me 10 minutes." As he worked, his thoughts drifted again to the basement. He imagined the neat rows of ingots, each one gleaming under the dim light like silent accusations. He wasn't a greedy man. He didn't want a mansion or a sports car. He just wanted what? He wasn't sure anymore. Maybe someone to talk to. Someone who didn't care about what he had or didn't have. "Got it," Greg said, tightening the last screw. The door swung shut with a satisfying click. Pete grinned. "You're a magician." "Just a guy with a wrench," Greg replied, packing up his tools. Pete handed him a few bills. "Breakfast's on the house." Greg hesitated. "You don't have to." "Don't argue with me," Pete said, wagging a finger. "Go sit down. Get some eggs in you." Greg smiled faintly and slid into a booth near the window. He ordered coffee and toast, keeping his eyes on the street outside. Westfield was quiet today, the kind of quiet that made you wonder if anything exciting would ever happen again. He didn't know it yet, but something was about to happen. Something that would turn his carefully constructed solitude upside down. And it would start with a woman he'd never seen before walking through the diner door. Chapter 2. A flea market surprise. Saturday mornings in Westfield had a rhythm all their own. By 9 o'clock, the town square was alive with chatter, the scent of fried dough, and the clinking of coins exchanging hands. The community flea market wasn't just a place to buy and sell. It was a social event, a weekly ritual where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee from the thermos stands. Greg parked his F-100 along the edge of the square, the bed empty now after yesterday's haul. He wasn't here to shop, not really. He came for odd jobs, fixing wobbly tables, hauling unsold furniture, tightening bolts on rusty lawn chairs. It was easy money and it kept him busy. Besides, he liked watching people haggle over things they didn't need. It was human nature at its finest. He strolled past rows of tables stacked with everything from antique lamps to mismatched mugs. Mrs. Callahan waved him over, her table overflowing with crocheted potholders. "Greg, you're just the man I need," she said, pointing to a folding chair that had collapsed under the weight of her yarn basket. Greg knelt down, inspecting the bent hinge. "Looks like it's seen better days," he said, pulling a wrench from his back pocket. "Give me a minute." As he worked, he heard the familiar hum of voices around him. Neighbors catching up, kids begging for ice cream, vendors shouting about bargains. It was comforting, predictable, until a voice he didn't recognize cut through the noise. "Excuse me, does anyone know where I can find a decent coffee around here?" Greg glanced up. The voice belonged to a woman standing a few feet away, holding a cardboard box filled with what looked like old books. She was different, not in a flashy way but in a way that made Greg notice. Her hair was a tumble of chestnut waves, her jeans cuffed at the ankles, and her boots looked like they'd seen more city sidewalks than country roads. She had an easy confidence, the kind that didn't quite fit the slow pace of Westfield. Mrs. Callahan perked up. "Sweetheart, the diner's just down the street," she said, pointing. "Best coffee in town." The woman smiled. "Perfect, thanks." Greg tightened the last bolt and stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. He told himself not to stare, but his curiosity had other plans. Outsiders were rare in Westfield, and this one didn't look like she was passing through. She looked like she belonged, at least she was trying to. "Mrs. Callahan leaned closer to Greg, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's Lila," she said. "Moved here last week. Bought the old Miller place." Greg raised an eyebrow. The Miller place had been empty for years. "Ha," he said, non-committal, though his mind was already turning over the possibilities. New people meant new stories and new gossip. Lila shifted the box in her arms, a book sliding dangerously close to the edge. Greg stepped forward before he could think better of it. "Careful," he said, catching the book mid-fall. He handed it back, their fingers brushing for the briefest second. "Thanks," she said, her smile quick and bright. "You've got good reflexes." Greg shrugged. "Comes with the territory." She tilted her head. "What territory is that?" He hesitated, suddenly aware of how ordinary his life sounded. "Handyman," he said finally. "Fix things. Haul things. Whatever people need." "Sounds useful," she said, her tone teasing but not unkind. "I could use someone like that." Greg felt a flicker of something, interest maybe, or trouble. "What kind of things?" he asked. She grinned. "Oh, you know, a leaky faucet. A door that sticks. A 100-year-old house that creaks like it's haunted." Greg chuckled. "You bought the Miller place?" "Yep," she said, shifting the box again. "Figured it had character." "That's one word for it," Greg said. "Another word is money pit." She laughed, and the sound was warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Guess I'll find out." Greg wanted to say more. Ask why she moved here, what she did before. But Mrs. Callahan swooped in like a hawk spotting a shiny object. "Lila, dear, you must come by the diner later," she said. "Everyone will want to meet you." Lila smiled politely. "I'll keep that in mind." Greg watched her walk away, the box of books balanced against her hip. He told himself it was nothing. Just a newcomer. Just a conversation. But as he packed up his tools and headed toward the diner for lunch, he couldn't shake the feeling that Westfield had just gotten a little less predictable. Chapter 3. Gossip and ice cream. The diner was buzzing louder than usual that afternoon, which meant one thing: fresh gossip. Greg slid into his usual booth by the window, the vinyl seat squeaking under him. He ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, hoping to eat in peace. But in Westfield, peace was a luxury, especially when something new stirred the pot. He didn't have to wait long. 2 booths over, Mrs. Callahan and her best friend, Doris, were leaning in so close their heads nearly touched. Greg caught snippets of their conversation over the clatter of dishes. "She's from the city, I heard," Doris whispered, her voice carrying just enough for half the diner to hear. "Moved into the Miller place. Alone." Mrs. Callahan gasped like someone had confessed to a crime. "Alone? At her age? That's unusual." Greg smirked into his coffee. "Here we go." "She's got boxes of books," Doris continued. "Saw her unloading them myself. Probably one of those intellectual types." Mrs. Callahan nodded sagely. "Or divorced." Greg nearly choked on his pie. He wasn't sure why that last bit irritated him, but it did. He focused on his plate, pretending not to listen, until the diner door swung open and the subject of their speculation walked in. Lila. She looked different in the warm glow of the diner lights. Less like a stranger, more like someone who belonged. Her hair was tucked into a knit cap, and she wore a faded leather jacket that had seen better days. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room with a smile that made Greg's stomach do something it hadn't done in years. Mrs. Callahan waved her over like a general summoning reinforcements. "Lila, dear, come sit with us." Lila hesitated, then spotted Greg. Her smile widened. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying just enough to silence the gossip brigade, "I think I'll sit with Greg." Greg blinked. "Me?" He managed a nod as she crossed the room and slid into the booth opposite him. "Hope you don't mind," she said, pulling off her cap. "You looked like the least intimidating person here." Greg chuckled. "That's probably accurate." The waitress appeared, all smiles and curiosity. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee," Lila said. "And whatever pie he's having." "Apple," Greg offered. "Perfect," Lila said, then turned back to him. "So, Greg the handyman, do you always eat alone?" He shrugged. "Most of the time." "Why?" she asked, tilting her head. "You don't seem like a hermit." Greg hesitated, searching for an answer that didn't sound pathetic. "Guess I like quiet," he said finally. "Less complicated." Lila smiled, and there was something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or amusement. Complicated isn't always bad. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Depends on who you ask." She laughed softly, and for a moment, the diner faded away. The gossip, the clinking dishes, the hum of conversation. It was just the two of them, sharing pie and coffee like old friends. "So," Lila said, breaking the spell, "what's the deal with this town? Everyone acts like they've known me for years." Greg smirked. "That's Westfield. News travels faster than light. You buy a house, they know what color your curtains are before you hang them." "Sounds cozy," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Cozy," Greg agreed. "And nosy." She grinned. "Good thing I like a challenge." Greg felt that flicker again, the one he'd ignored at the flea market. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew one thing. Life in Westfield was about to get a lot less quiet. Chapter 4. The problem gets bigger. Greg's basement looked like a dragon's hoard. If dragons cared about neat rows and labeled shelves, copper ingots stacked like bricks, aluminum gleaming in dull silver tones, and gold, well, gold didn't take up much space, but it sure made his pulse quicken every time he saw it. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands on his hips, surveying the chaos. There was no denying it anymore. He was out of room. The last hall, a busted washing machine and 2 old desktop towers, had pushed him to the brink. He'd stripped them down, melted the metals, and now had nowhere to put the ingots without blocking the path to his furnace. He'd been careful for years, methodical, almost obsessive. But now, he was one broken appliance away from stacking gold bars in his kitchen. Greg rubbed the back of his neck, frustration simmering. He didn't need the money, not really. His bills were paid, his truck ran, mostly, and he had enough canned soup to survive a blizzard. But the thought of all that value sitting here, useless, gnawed at him. He could do something with it. He should do something with it. Except how? He'd spent the past week researching online. Late at night, hunched over his old laptop. Every option sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. Pawn shops? Too risky. Online buyers? Scams everywhere. Banks? Forget it. He'd have to explain where the metals came from, and that was a conversation he wasn't having. The idea of someone in town finding out made his stomach twist. Westfield's gossip network would turn him into a walking lottery ticket overnight. He imagined the headlines in the diner: Greg Benson, secret millionaire. Mrs. Callahan would faint. Doris would start a betting pool on who'd marry him first. Half the town would show up at his door with casseroles and suspicious smiles. "No thank you." Greg sighed and sat on the bottom step, staring at the furnace. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "People throw money away every day. A smart man knows how to profit from other people's trash." Well, he'd done that part. Now what? His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. A text from Pete at the diner. "Got another freezer acting up. You free tomorrow?" Greg typed back a quick sure and shoved the phone away. Work was simple. Work made sense. Unlike this mess. He climbed the stairs, locking the basement door behind him like it was guarding state secrets. In a way, it was. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch, flipping through channels without really watching. His mind kept circling back to the same problem. He needed advice. Real advice. But who could he trust? Not anyone in Westfield. That was a hard no. He needed someone who didn't know him. Someone who wouldn't care about the money. Someone smart enough to help him figure out how to turn ingots into cash without ending up on the evening news. Greg took a long swig of beer and stared at the ceiling. He hated asking for help. Always had. But this wasn't about pride anymore, it was about survival. His basement was full, his options were shrinking, and for the first time in years, Greg Benson felt like he was standing on the edge of something big. Something dangerous. Something that might change everything. And then, like a spark in the dark, a thought hit him. Lila. She was new. She didn't know the town's gossip rules yet. She seemed sharp, independent, not the type to run her mouth. And she'd said she liked a challenge. Greg set the beer down, his pulse ticking faster. He wasn't about to spill his secret, not yet. But maybe he could start small. A hypothetical question. A casual conversation. Nothing suspicious. He leaned back, a slow grin tugging at his lips. Tomorrow he'd see her again. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find out if Lila was the kind of person you could trust with a secret worth more than gold. Chapter 5. An unexpected offer. Sunday morning brought a pale winter sun, and the kind of cold that made Greg's breath puff like smoke as he drove down the winding road toward the Miller place. He told himself this was just another job. Fix a leaky faucet, tighten a few screws, maybe patch a door. Nothing unusual. But his pulse had other ideas, thudding like a drum as the old F-100 rattled along. The Miller place sat on a rise just outside town. A weathered Victorian with peeling paint and a porch that sagged like it had given up on life. Greg parked in the gravel drive and climbed out, toolbox in hand. Before he could knock, the front door swung open. Greg! Lila's voice was bright, her smile even brighter. She wore a flannel shirt over a faded tee, jeans tucked into boots, and her hair was pulled back in a messy knot that somehow looked intentional. You're a lifesaver. Greg grinned. Depends on the day. She stepped aside, waving him in. Come on. The kitchen's this way. The inside of the house was a mix of charm and chaos, hardwood floors scuffed from decades of footsteps, walls lined with bookshelves already half filled, and boxes stacked like miniature skyscrapers. It smelled faintly of dust and coffee, with a hint of something floral. The faucet's possessed, Lila said as they entered the kitchen. Keeps dripping no matter what I do. I even tried yelling at it. Greg chuckled, setting his toolbox on the counter. That usually works on teenagers, not plumbing. Good to know, she said, leaning against the doorway as he crouched by the sink. So, tell me, how does a guy become the town's go-to handyman? Family business. Greg shook his head, twisting the valve with practiced ease. Nope, just started fixing things. People kept calling. Guess word got around. Sounds like you're good at it, she said. Pete at the diner swears you're magic. Greg smirked. Just a guy with a wrench. Aha, she said, her tone teasing. And reflexes like a superhero. Greg felt heat creep up his neck. He focused on the faucet, tightening the joint until the drip stopped. There, he said, standing. Should hold. Lila clapped her hands. You're officially my favorite person today. Greg smiled, but his mind was already spinning. This was his chance, maybe not to spill everything, but to start small. A hypothetical. Casual. Nothing that would set off alarm bells. So, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Hypothetically, if someone had, say, a bunch of scrap metal lying around, what would you do with it? Lila raised an eyebrow. Scrap metal? Yeah, Greg said, trying for nonchalance. Like copper, aluminum. Stuff from old appliances. She tilted her head, considering. Depends. If it's a little, I'd take it to a recycling center. If it's a lot, her eyes narrowed playfully. You're not secretly building a robot army, are you? Greg laughed, maybe a little too quickly. No, definitely not. Shame, she said, grinning. That would make this town way more interesting. Greg chuckled, but inside, relief and nerves tangled like wires. She didn't press, she didn't pry, just joked and moved on. Maybe this could work. Why do you ask? She said, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. Greg shrugged, taking the one she offered. Just curious. People throw away a lot of stuff. True, she said, sipping her coffee. One person's trash, another person's treasure. Greg met her eyes over the rim of his mug, and for a moment, the air felt charged, like they were talking about more than scrap metal. Chapter 6. Secrets and Slip UPS. Greg wasn't sure when his life had turned into a balancing act, but lately, every conversation with Lila felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of gossip. One wrong word, one careless hint, and his secret would tumble out like a loose bolt. It started innocently enough. Tuesday afternoon, Greg was at the Miller place again, tightening a stubborn hinge on the back door while Lila unpacked boxes in the living room. The house was slowly transforming from a dusty relic into something warm and lived in, thanks to her relentless energy and questionable taste in throw pillows. You know, Lila called from the other room. I think this place is trying to kill me. Greg smirked, adjusting the hinge. That bad? Worse? She said, appearing in the doorway with a stack of books. Every time I fix one thing, two more break. It's like a horror movie, but with plumbing. Greg chuckled. Welcome to home ownership. She set the books down and leaned against the frame, watching him work. So, Mr. Handyman, what's your secret? You always seem to know how to fix everything. Greg hesitated, the screwdriver pausing mid-turn. Don't say too much. Keep it simple. Just practice, he said. And curiosity. Curiosity? She echoed, intrigued. Greg nodded, tightening the last screw. I like figuring things out. How they work. Why they break. Sounds like a scientist, she teased. Or a magician. Greg laughed, but his pulse ticked faster. Not quite. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing playfully. You're hiding something. Greg froze. What? You've got that look, she said, grinning. Like you've got a secret lab in your basement where you build rocket ships. Greg barked a laugh. Too loud. Too quick. Rocket ships? No, definitely not. Uh-huh, she said, crossing her arms. Then why do you look guilty? I don't look guilty, Greg said, trying for casual. I look focused. Focused? She repeated, her tone dripping with mock suspicion. Sure. Greg turned back to the hinge, hoping she couldn't see the heat creeping up his neck. He'd almost said too much, almost mentioned the furnace, the metals, the stacks of ingots that could buy half the town. Instead, he swallowed the truth and forced a smile. "Doors fixed," he said, stepping back. "No more horror movie." Lila grinned. "Thanks. You're officially my hero." Greg felt that flicker again, the one that made his chest tighten and his thoughts scatter. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to trust her. But trust was dangerous, and Greg Benson had spent his whole life avoiding danger. Still, as he packed up his tools and Lila walked him to the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tightrope was getting thinner, and the fall, if it came, would change everything. Chapter 7. The town turns up the heat. By Thursday, Greg was starting to suspect that Westfield had developed a new national sport, speculating about his love life. It began with a few curious glances at the diner, then whispers at the hardware store, and by midweek, the gossip network was running hotter than Pete's griddle. He first noticed it when Doris cornered him near the coffee station at the diner. "So, Greg," she said, her voice sweet as syrup but sharp as a tack. "How's that Miller place coming along?" Greg blinked. "Fine, I guess. Hum." Doris leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets. "Lila's a lovely girl. Smart, pretty, single." Greg felt his ears burn. Good to know?" Doris patted his arm like he was a shy teenager. "Don't be modest. People are saying you two make a cute couple." Greg nearly dropped his coffee. "People are saying what?" But Doris was already sashaying away, leaving Greg to stew in a mix of embarrassment and mild panic. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the gossip itself or the fact that part of him didn't hate the idea. By the time he finished his coffee, 3 more people had hinted at how nice it must be to have company, and whether he'd be bringing someone to the movie night. Greg left the diner feeling like he'd been drafted into a romance he hadn't signed up for. That evening, he drove out to the Miller place to fix a stubborn window latch. Lila greeted him at the door with her usual easy smile, completely unaware that half the town had already planned their wedding. "Hey, hero," she said, stepping aside. "Come in. The window's upstairs." Greg followed her up the creaky staircase, toolbox in hand, trying to ignore the way his pulse jumped every time she laughed. He told himself this was just a job, just a latch, nothing more. "So," Lila said as they reached the bedroom, "you've been quiet today. Everything okay?" Greg hesitated, fiddling with the latch. "Yeah, just people talking." "About what?" she asked, settling on the edge of the bed. Greg cleared his throat. "Us." Her eyebrows shot up. "Us." "Yeah," he said, focusing on the latch like it held the secrets of the universe. "Apparently, we're the hottest topic in town." Lila laughed, a bright, unrestrained sound that made Greg's chest tighten. "Let me guess. Doris, and Mrs. Callahan," Greg muttered, "and Pete, and probably half the diner." She grinned. "Well, that didn't take long." Greg sighed, setting down the screwdriver. "Sorry, I know you didn't sign up for this circus." Lila shrugged, her smile softening. "Honestly, I think it's kind of funny." Greg blinked. "Funny?" "Yeah," she said, her tone teasing. "You're like Westfield's most eligible bachelor, and I'm the mysterious newcomer. It's practically a Hallmark movie." Greg groaned. "Please don't say that." She laughed again, then tilted her head. "Does it bother you?" Greg hesitated, the truth hovering on his tongue. "A little," he admitted. "I'm not great with attention." Lila studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you could just tell them we're friends." Greg nodded slowly. "Yeah, friends." But as he packed up his tools and headed downstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that the word didn't quite fit anymore. Not for him. Not for the way his heart sped up every time she smiled. Chapter 8. A risky plan. Greg stared at his phone for a full 5 minutes before working up the nerve to type the message. "Hey, you busy?" Simple, casual, non-threatening. He hit send and immediately regretted it. 3 seconds later, the screen lit up. "Not really. What's up?" Greg exhaled slowly, like he'd just defused a bomb. "Got a question. Hypothetical." There was a pause. Then, "Sounds intriguing. Shoot." Greg grabbed his jacket and keys before he could talk himself out of it. Texting was too risky. Tone got lost and he needed to see her face when he asked. 10 minutes later, his truck crunched up the gravel drive to the Miller place, headlights slicing through the dark. The porch light flicked on, and Lila appeared in the doorway, bundled in a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Well," she said, grinning, "this is the most dramatic way anyone's ever asked me a hypothetical." Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry, didn't want to bother you." "You didn't," she said, stepping aside. "Come in. I was just making tea." The house was warm, glowing with lamplight and the faint scent of cinnamon. Boxes still lingered in corners, but it felt more like a home now, her home. Greg followed her into the kitchen, where she handed him a mug and perched on the counter like she owned the place. "So," she said, eyes bright with curiosity, "what's this big hypothetical?" Greg sat at the table, fingers curling around the mug. "Okay, say someone had a lot of scrap metal, Like a lot. What's the smartest way to turn that into cash without, getting robbed or looking suspicious? Lila blinked, then laughed. Wow, that's oddly specific. Greg forced a shrug. Just thinking out loud. Uh-huh, she said, sliding off the counter and pulling out a chair. Well, first question. How much is a lot? Greg hesitated. Hypothetically, enough to fill a basement. Her eyebrows shot up. That's not scrap. That's a collection. Greg chuckled nervously. Guess so. Lila leaned back, studying him with a mix of amusement and intrigue. Okay, Mr. Hypothetical. You've got options. Recycling centers for the basics, specialty buyers for the good stuff. Or, she tapped her chin thoughtfully, you could melt it down and sell it as ingots. Greg's heart skipped. Why ingots? Easier to store. Easier to ship. People pay good money for pure metal, she said, then grinned. Not that I'm an expert. Just watched a lot of weird documentaries. Greg stared at her, torn between relief and panic. She was sharp, too sharp. If he wasn't careful, she'd connect the dots. So, she continued, leaning forward. Why do I feel like this isn't hypothetical? Greg laughed. Too loud. Too quick. Because you have a suspicious mind. Guilty, she said, smiling. But hey, if you ever do have a basement full of metal, call me. I love a good challenge. Greg met her eyes, and for a moment, the air felt charged, like they were standing on the edge of something big, something dangerous, something that could change everything. Chapter 9. Disaster at the diner. Saturday mornings at Pete's Diner were usually predictable. Coffee, pancakes, and enough gossip to power the town for a week. Greg had planned to grab a quick breakfast, fix a freezer, and leave before anyone cornered him about Lila again. Simple. Safe. Except nothing in Westfield stayed simple for long. He walked in, toolbox in hand, and immediately felt the shift in the air. Heads turned. Conversations dipped. It was like stepping onto a stage without knowing his lines. Greg ignored it, slid into his usual booth, and ordered coffee. He was halfway through his first sip when the door swung open and in walked Lila. Bright smile, messy bun, and a scarf that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The diner went silent for a beat, then erupted in whispers. Greg groaned inwardly. Here we go. Lila spotted him and waved, her grin widening as she crossed the room. Mind if I join? Greg hesitated, then nodded. Sure. She slid into the booth opposite him, shrugging off her scarf. You look like a man bracing for impact. Greg smirked. Something like that. Before he could explain, Doris materialized like a genie, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Well, she said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. Look at you two. Cozy. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Doris steamrolled on. Pete, 2 coffees for the lovebirds. Greg nearly choked. Doris, Lila laughed, unbothered. Guess we're official now. Greg shot her a look, but she just grinned, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Pete appeared with 2 mugs, his grin matching Doris's. On the house, Pete said. For the happy couple. Greg buried his face in his hands. We're not. Sure you're not, Doris said, winking. So, Greg, when's the big day? The diner erupted in laughter. Greg felt his ears burn, his pulse spike. He needed an escape fast. But then, as if fate had a twisted sense of humor, Pete called from behind the counter. Hey Greg, got that freezer door fixed? Or are you too busy planning your honeymoon? Greg stood so fast his chair screeched. Freezer, right, on it. He grabbed his toolbox and fled to the kitchen, Lila trailing behind, still laughing. When they were out of earshot, Greg leaned against the counter, exhaling hard. Sorry, he muttered. This town is relentless, Lila finished, her eyes dancing. But honestly, that was hilarious. Greg shook his head. You're enjoying this way too much. Maybe, she said, grinning. But hey, at least they like me. Greg chuckled despite himself. They like you a little too much. She tilted her head, studying him. Does it bother you? Greg hesitated, then sighed. Just don't want people making assumptions. Fair, she said softly. But for what it's worth, I don't mind. Greg met her eyes, and for a moment, the chaos faded. It was just the 2 of them, standing in a warm kitchen, sharing something that felt dangerously close to more. Then Pete hollered from the front, shattering the moment. Greg, Doris wants to know if you need a wedding cake sample. Lila burst out laughing. Greg groaned, and somewhere deep down, beneath the embarrassment and the noise, he realized something. He didn't hate the idea as much as he thought. Chapter 10. The reveal. Greg had rehearsed the words 100 times in his head, but now, standing in Lila's kitchen with the hum of the old refrigerator and the scent of cinnamon tea lingering in the air, every version sounded wrong. She was perched on the counter again, legs swinging, watching him with that curious tilt of her head that made him feel like a puzzle she was determined to solve. You've been quiet, she said softly. More than usual. Greg gripped the edge of the table, his pulse thudding like a hammer. There's something I need to tell you. Her eyebrows lifted. Sounds serious. It is, he said, his voice low. And I need you to promise you won't freak out. Lila smiled faintly. Greg, you're not about to tell me you're married with 6 kids, are you? He almost laughed. Almost. No, nothing like that. Then I'm listening, she said, her tone gentle now. Greg took a breath, steadying himself. You know how I asked about scrap metal? Hypothetically? Uh-huh, she said, eyes narrowing with amusement. Let me guess. Not so hypothetical. Greg nodded slowly. Not even close. He crossed the room, opened the back door, and gestured for her to follow. The night air was crisp, stars scattered like silver dust across the sky. He led her to his truck, parked at the curb, and opened the passenger door. Inside sat a small wooden box, heavy enough to make the springs groan. Greg lifted the lid. Lila leaned in and froze. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were gleaming ingots of copper, aluminum, and gold, their surfaces catching the porch light like captured fire. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Greg, she whispered. What is this? Years of work, he said quietly. I've been hauling junk for years, stripping it down, melting the metals, saving them. She stared at the box, then at him. This is a fortune. Greg shrugged, his throat tight. Maybe. I don't know. I never sold any of it. Didn't want people to know. Money changes things. Lila was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Greg braced himself for shock, for judgment, for the inevitable question. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Instead, she laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A full, bright laugh that rang out into the night. Greg blinked, stunned. Sorry, she said, wiping her eyes. It's just, I thought you were hiding something dramatic, like a criminal past, or a secret family. But this? You're basically a recycling superhero. Greg stared at her. You're not mad. Mad. She grinned. Greg, this is amazing. You turned trash into treasure. Literally. He exhaled, relief flooding his chest. I was afraid you'd think I was weird. Oh, you're definitely weird, she said, her eyes sparkling. But in a good way. Greg laughed then, the tension breaking like a snapped wire. So, you're okay with this? Okay. She hopped off the counter, her grin widening. I want in. Greg blinked. In? Yeah, she said, hands on her hips. You've got a basement full of metal and no plan. I've got ideas. We make a team. Greg felt something shift inside him. Something big, something bright. For years, he'd lived in quiet solitude, guarding his secret like a dragon guarding gold. And now, here was Lila, fearless and grinning, ready to turn his hidden world into something more. Something shared. Something that felt a lot like hope. Chapter 11. Turning trash into treasure, Greg had never thought his basement would feel crowded with 2 people in it. But as Lila stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands on her hips, surveying the stacks of gleaming ingots, Greg realized how small his world had been until now. Wow, she said, her voice low with awe. When you said a lot, I pictured, I don't know, a few boxes. This looks like Fort Knox. Greg rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. Yeah, it got out of hand. Out of hand. She laughed, stepping closer to run her fingers over a copper bar. Greg, this is insane. Do you have any idea what this is worth? He shrugged. Enough to make me nervous. Lila turned, her eyes bright with excitement. So what's the plan? Greg blinked. Plan? Yeah, she said, grinning. You didn't drag me down here just to admire your shiny bricks. We're going to figure out how to sell this without turning you into the town's golden goose. Greg chuckled. Golden goose. Trust me, she said, wagging a finger. If Doris finds out about this, you'll have casseroles on your porch for the rest of your life. Greg groaned. Don't remind me. Lila grabbed a notepad from a nearby box and plopped onto a stool. Okay, step 1, inventory. How much do we have? Greg hesitated. A lot. She shot him a look. Numbers, Benson. Not vibes. Greg sighed and started rattling off rough estimates. Copper, aluminum, zinc, silver, gold. Lila scribbled furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, she whistled low. Greg, she said, holding up the list. You're sitting on enough to buy half of Westfield. Which is exactly why I've been hiding it, he said. Fair, she admitted. But hiding isn't a plan. We need strategy. Greg leaned against the workbench, watching her as she paced the basement like a general plotting a campaign. You seem really into this. Are you kidding? She said, grinning. This is the most exciting thing that's happened to me since I moved here. Plus, I love puzzles. Greg smiled, warmth blooming in his chest. For years, this secret had been a weight, a burden he carried alone. Now, with Lila scribbling ideas and tossing out jokes about metal monopoly, it felt lighter, almost fun. Okay, she said, tapping the notepad. We start small. Sell the common stuff, copper, aluminum, through legit channels. No big flashy moves. Then, once we've got a system, we tackle the gold. Greg raised an eyebrow. You make it sound easy. It's not, she said, her grin widening. But that's what makes it fun. Greg laughed, shaking his head. You're something else. Compliment accepted, she said, flashing him a smile that made his pulse skip. They spent the next hour brainstorming websites, buyers, shipping logistics. At one point, Lila suggested disguising the ingots as art pieces, which led to Greg sketching a stick figure sculpture that made her laugh so hard she nearly fell off the stool. By the time they climbed the stairs, the night was deep and quiet, stars glittering through the kitchen window. Greg felt different, lighter, hopeful, like maybe this wasn't just about metals anymore. Maybe it was about building something bigger, something that included her. As Lila walked him to the door, she paused, her smile softening. You know, she said, this is going to change things. Greg met her gaze, his chest tightening. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of change. Chapter 12. The big decision. Greg had never been good at big decisions. He liked small ones, the kind you could fix with a wrench or a screwdriver. But now, standing in his kitchen with the weight of Lila's words echoing in his head, he knew this wasn't something he could patch up with a quick turn of a bolt. This is going to change things, she'd said. And she was right. For years, Greg had built his life around simplicity. No risks, no surprises, just quiet days, odd jobs, and a secret that sat heavy in his basement like a silent promise. But now, that promise was knocking louder than ever, and Lila was the one holding the door open. He stared at the notepad they'd filled last night, covered in scribbles and arrows and half-baked ideas. It wasn't just a plan to sell metal. It was a blueprint for something bigger, a business, maybe, a future. One that didn't involve hiding in the shadows. The thought thrilled him and terrified him. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A text from Lila. Movie night at the theater. 2 options, rom-com or action. Your call. Greg smiled despite himself. She had a way of making everything feel lighter, even when the world felt heavy. He typed back, rom-com. Seems fitting. The theater was small, just one screen and a popcorn machine that squeaked like it needed a retirement plan. Greg and Lila sat in the back row, sharing a tub of popcorn while the opening credits rolled. The movie was predictable. Meet cute, misunderstandings, grand gestures, but Greg barely noticed. His mind was on the decision looming over him like a storm cloud. Halfway through, Lila leaned close, her voice low. You're quiet again. Greg hesitated, then whispered back, just thinking. About what? She asked, her eyes catching the flicker of the screen. Greg swallowed hard. About change. She studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. Change isn't always bad. Greg let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It's scary. Sure, she said, her tone gentle. But so is staying stuck. Her words hit like a spark to dry tinder. Greg stared at her, the glow of the screen painting her face in soft light. She wasn't just talking about metals. She was talking about him, his life, his choices, his fear of stepping into something bigger. And suddenly, Greg knew. He didn't want to stay stuck. Not anymore. After the movie, they walked out into the cold night, stars scattered across the sky like spilled glitter. Greg stopped by his truck, turning to face her. I've made up my mind, he said, his voice steady now. Lila raised an eyebrow. About what? About the metals. About everything. He took a breath. I'm done hiding. I want to do this. The plan. With you. Her smile bloomed slow and bright, warming him more than the jacket on his back. You mean it? Greg nodded. Yeah, I mean it. She grinned, stepping closer. Good. Because I was starting to think you'd chicken out. Greg laughed, the sound breaking free like a weight lifting off his chest. Not this time. And then, before he could overthink it, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a grand gesture, not like the movies, but it was real. Warm. Certain. The kind of kiss that said everything words couldn't. I trust you. I need you. I want this. When they pulled apart, Lila's eyes sparkled like the stars overhead. Guess Westfield's gossip network is about to explode. Greg grinned. Let M. For once, they'll be right. Chapter 13. A new chapter. Westfield had never seen so much excitement over a yard sale. Technically, it wasn't a yard sale. It was a metal art showcase, as Lila had dubbed it. Greg wasn't sure how she'd convinced him to turn his ingots into decorative pieces. But somehow, his basement stash now looked like a gallery of rustic sculptures and minimalist bookends. Copper pyramids, aluminum candle holders, even a gold paperweight shaped like a heart. Lila's idea, of course. It's genius, she said, arranging the display on a long table outside the Miller place. People think they're buying art. We get rid of the metals without raising eyebrows. Win-win. Greg eyed a copper pyramid skeptically. You really think anyone's gonna buy this? Are you kidding? Lila grinned. This town loves anything that looks fancy. Doris will probably buy 3. As if summoned by name, Doris appeared at the end of the driveway, her eyes lighting up like Christmas morning. Oh my stars. What is all this? Art, Lila said smoothly. Greg's been working on it for years. Greg nearly choked. Years. Doris clasped her hands. Well, aren't you talented? I'll take that shiny one. She pointed to the gold heart. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Lila shot him a look that said don't ruin this. He swallowed his words and handed it over, watching as Doris marched off like she'd just scored a treasure. By noon, half the town had stopped by. Pete bought a copper pyramid for the diner. Mrs. Callahan snagged 2 aluminum bookends. Even old Mr. Turner wandered over, muttering something about modern art, as he handed Greg a 20. Greg couldn't believe it. The medals were disappearing, the cash was piling up, and nobody suspected a thing. Well, almost nobody. As the last customer left, Lila turned to him, her smile bright and triumphant. Told you it would work. Greg shook his head, laughing. You're unbelievable. Compliment accepted, she said, slipping her arm through his. So, what's next? Greg looked at her. The woman who'd walked into his quiet life and turned it upside down in the best possible way. The woman who'd seen his secret and didn't run. The woman who made him believe change wasn't something to fear. Next, he said, his grin slow and certain. Next, we build something bigger. Lila's eyes sparkled. Together. Together, Greg said, and meant it. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Greg felt lighter than he had in years. The medals were gone or going, and in their place was something far more valuable. Possibility. A future that wasn't just about surviving, but living, laughing, loving. Westfield would keep talking, of course. The gossip network would hum louder than ever. But for once, Greg didn't care. Let them talk. He had Lila. He had a plan. And for the first time in his life, Greg Benson wasn't just fixing things. He was building something that mattered. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Miller place looked different now. The peeling paint was gone, replaced by a soft sage green that Lila insisted was timeless. The porch no longer sagged. The garden bloomed with wildflowers, and the old Victorian had become a home. A real one, filled with laughter, plans, and the occasional argument about throw pillows. Greg stood on that porch now, coffee in hand, watching the morning sun spill across the yard. Inside, he could hear Lila humming as she flipped through a wedding magazine, her voice mingling with the clink of dishes. A year ago, he'd been a man with a secret and a basement full of metal. Now, he was a man with a fiancée and a future that felt bigger than anything he'd imagined. Greg. Lila's voice floated through the screen door. Do we want the ceremony at the lake or the garden? Greg grinned. Whichever one involves less mud. She appeared in the doorway, barefoot, her hair tumbling over her shoulders. Lake it is, she said, flashing him a smile that still made his chest tighten. And before you ask, yes, Doris is already planning the flower arrangements. Greg groaned. Of course she is. Lila laughed, stepping out to join him. You know, for a guy who hated attention, you're about to have 200 people staring at you. Greg took her hand, squeezing gently. As long as you're there, I don't care. Her smile softened, and for a moment, the world felt still. Perfect. Then she nudged him playfully. Speaking of attention, how's our little side hustle? Greg chuckled. Better than I expected. Who knew people would pay that much for industrial chic bookends? Hey, she said, grinning. We turned trash into treasure and a business. Not bad for a year. Greg looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who'd walked into his quiet life and turned it into something extraordinary. Not bad at all. They sat together on the porch, planning a wedding and a future that stretched far beyond Westfield. There would be challenges, sure. Change always came with them. But Greg wasn't afraid anymore. He had Lila. He had a life worth building. And for the first time, he wasn't just fixing things. He was creating something that would last.